When city planners describe the 1857 Chicago street raising, they focus on progress. Lifting an entire city out of the mud, installing modern sewers, creating proper drainage for a booming metropolis. The official reports celebrate engineering triumph, urban modernization, the transformation of a frontier settlement into a functioning city. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers or municipal ledgers, began 12 feet below street level, in the basements that used to be ground floors. Workers didn't raise streets, they filled buildings, perfectly functional first floors with ornate stonework, arched windows, decorative entrances, all sealed with compacted earth and rubble. Not damaged buildings, not obsolete structures. Buildings that were intact, functional, architecturally complete. This wasn't mentioned in public reports. It didn't make it into the Board of Public Works documents. But in the contractor notes from that year, in the margins of construction ledgers, a quiet phrase appears over and over again. Pre-existing masonry, origin undetermined. Chicago wasn't alone. Seattle, 1889. San Francisco, 1850s through 1870s. New York, 1865. Every major city across North America reported the same phenomenon within a 30-year window. The official explanation remained identical everywhere. Street raising for improved drainage, modernization, progress. But the physical evidence told a different story. Photographs from the 1870s and 1880s show something impossible to ignore. Basement windows at ground level, not crude cellar openings cut into foundation stone. Ornate stonework, decorative arches, window frames with detailed carpentry. Glass still intact, undamaged. These were designed as first-floor windows, windows meant to let sunlight into main living spaces, not cellars. Their proportions were wrong for basement openings. Their placement was wrong. Their craftsmanship was wrong. Everything about them screamed ground floor, yet they sat below street level, half buried in compacted earth. The doors presented the same paradox. Grand entrances with carved stone lintels, marble steps leading down instead of up, doorways that opened into rooms filled with sediment, not construction debris. You can see this preserved today in Seattle's Underground Tour original storefronts 12 feet below the modern city. Intact, functional, just buried. No evidence of demolition, no piles of broken masonry, no signs these buildings were damaged, condemned, or structurally unsound. Just burial. Systematic, deliberate burial. And then there was the alignment problem. The buried first floors aligned perfectly on the same street grid as the roads above them. Same architectural style, same construction techniques, same building materials. As if two identical cities existed in the same location, one stacked directly atop the other. Workers' notes from the era describe this in fragments. Older foundations beneath older foundations. Pre-existing street pavement below new pavement. Masonry layers inconsistent with settlement timeline. Their alignment was off. Not off by error, but off by era. The stonework didn't resemble crude frontier construction. Chicago was officially founded in 1833, a settlement of barely 200 people, yet the buried structures showed urban-scale architecture, multi-story buildings, coordinated street grids, public buildings with grand entrances and decorative facades, infrastructure that implied populations in the thousands, not hundreds. San Francisco's buried buildings told the same story. Founded in 1786 as a Spanish mission, supposedly a small outpost until the gold rush of 1849. But excavations in the 1860s and 70s revealed foundations beneath foundations, street-level structures that predated the mission records, architecture that didn't match Spanish colonial style or indigenous construction. This wasn't mentioned in public reports. Newspaper accounts from the 1850s and 60s occasionally referenced unusual sediment deposits or unexplained mud layers. But by the 1870s, the language shifted. Street improvement projects, drainage modernization. The buried buildings became basements in official records, even when photographs clearly showed they were designed as ground floors. Engineers tried to categorize everything simply. Basements were always basements. Ground floors were always ground floors. But as photographs accumulated from city after city, as construction crews kept finding the same pattern, ornate windows underground, grand doorways buried, intact buildings filled with earth, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why would you bury perfectly good architecture? Why fill functional buildings with tons of compacted earth instead of simply demolishing them? Why did this happen everywhere simultaneously within the same 30-year window? And why did the official explanation, street raising for drainage, require filling the interiors of buildings, not just raising the roads around them? The buried structures weren't just older, they were better. Chicago's raised streets sit atop masonry more advanced than anything the city was supposedly capable of producing in the 1850s. Buried walls show tighter joints than the surface structures built above them. Blocks fitted without visible mortar gaps. Stone cut and placed with precision that required tools and techniques beyond mid-19th century frontier capability. Photographs from excavations in the 1880s and 90s show this clearly. Workers standing beside blocks so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Not rough-hewn frontier stone, not the crude masonry of early American settlement. These were geometrically cut blocks, fitted with tolerances measured in millimeters. Much larger blocks, much tighter joints. Patterns that seemed too mathematically precise. The brick patterns presented another impossibility. Seattle's underground preserves intact, brick streets beneath the modern pavement. The official explanation attributes their burial to the aftermath of the Great Fire of 1889. The city rebuilt at a higher elevation to prevent future flooding. But the buried brick streets show no fire damage, no heat cracking, no carbon scoring, no evidence of the catastrophic blaze that supposedly necessitated their abandonment. Instead, the bricks show water erosion, deep, consistent wear patterns from prolonged water flow, and stranger still, some sections display vitrified surfaces, glossy, glass-like finishes that require extreme heat during manufacturing, not during use. This wasn't primitive frontier brickwork. This was industrial-scale ceramic production, suggesting kilns capable of temperatures that frontier settlements shouldn't have possessed. The buildings themselves were designed for a different ground level entirely. The buried first floors have 14 to 16-foot ceilings. Massive, soaring interior spaces with elaborate plasterwork, decorative moldings, architectural details that only make sense in primary living areas. The current ground floors above them, 8 to 10-foot ceilings. Standard, utilitarian, functional. The proportions tell the story. The buried level was the primary architectural statement. Grand ballrooms, theatre spaces, public halls with crystal chandeliers, all now underground. San Francisco photographs from the 1870s show basement spaces, with ornate ceiling medallions, wall sconces positioned for gas lighting, decorative columns that serve no structural purpose in a cellar? Why build such elaborate spaces below grade? Why waste expensive materials and skilled labor on rooms designed to be buried? You wouldn't. Unless they weren't designed to be buried. Unless they were ground floors, and something buried them. But this wasn't just an American phenomenon. European cities reported the identical pattern during the same timeline. Cologne, Germany. Trou ut tueries, bombing damage. In 1945, exposed streets 15 feet below the modern surface. Not Roman ruins. Not medieval foundations. Streets with intact pavement, drainage systems, building foundations that predated the city's official medieval construction dates. Budapest, Prague, Edinburgh. All have extensive medieval vaults that were supposedly always underground. But architectural analysis reveals the same anomaly. These weren't built as vaults. They were built as ground-level structures. The vaulted ceilings, the window placements, the doorway proportions, everything indicates they were designed for surface use, then buried. The timeline was synchronized. 1840 to 1870, across the Atlantic, dozens of cities, same depth of burial, same official explanation, same systematic filling of functional buildings with earth. Why were the buried structures more sophisticated? Why were they aligned on the same grid as the cities above? Why did construction techniques in buried layers surpass the capabilities of the surface structures built to replace them? And then there were the watermarks. New York excavations during subway construction in the early 1900s revealed something that contradicted every official explanation. Buried walls showed horizontal staining at consistent heights, 12 to 15 feet up interior walls. Not gradual sediment lines, not construction residue. These were flood lines, sharp, distinct boundaries between clean stone below and stained stone above. The pattern matched catastrophic flooding, not gradual accumulation, not the slow buildup of sediment over decades. This was rapid, waterborne deposition. Mud carried by massive volumes of moving water, deposited in a single event or series of closely spaced events. Photographs from excavations show this clearly. Dark horizontal bands across pale limestone, marking exactly how high the water reached. In building after building, block after block, always the same height. Always between 10 and 15 feet. But there were no flood records in official accounts for the 1840 to 1860 period. No documentation of catastrophic flooding. No newspaper reports of cities inundated by water and mud. The historical record showed normal settlement expansion, routine construction, standard urban development. Yet the physical evidence showed something else entirely. Walls that had been underwater, sediment deposited by flooding, buildings buried by mud, not by intentional filling. It was as if every city was copying an original blueprint, one that existed before the mud came, one that was already there, already built, already functioning, when something catastrophic buried it 12 feet deep. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the physical evidence. It was what didn't appear in written records. Official documents from the 1850s and 60s barely mentioned the buried structures. Construction reports focused on new street elevations, rarely acknowledging what lay beneath. Architectural. Surveys documented surface buildings, while ignoring the sophisticated masonry they were built atop. The deeper construction crews dug, the harder it became to fit these findings into the clean narrative of American expansion and European urbanization. Cities officially founded in the 1830s and 1850s contain buried infrastructure from before their founding dates. Chicago was incorporated in 1833. The settlement records describe a population of approximately 200 people, fur traders, military personnel, a handful of merchants. Yet, excavations in the 1860s and 70s revealed buried structures carbon dated to the 1790s and early 1810s. Not small cabins, not temporary shelters, multi-story buildings with stone foundations, connected street grids, public buildings with architectural flourishes. The official explanation: early settlement buildings from French and British traders. But the contradiction is immediate. These are urban structures, coordinated, grid-aligned, built with materials, and techniques that require supply chains, skilled labor, large populations. Settlements of 200 people don't build opera houses. They don't construct multi-story stone theatres with decorative facades and grand entrance halls. They don't lay out perfectly geometric street grids spanning dozens of city blocks. Yet, the buried structures showed exactly this: urban planning, civic architecture, infrastructure designed for thousands of inhabitants, not hundreds. San Francisco presented an even more troubling paradox. Subway construction in the early 1900s broke through into buried chambers beneath Market Street. Train station foundations, platform structures, iron rail mounts embedded in stone. But San Francisco's first railroad didn't arrive until the Transcontinental Line was completed in 1869. The city was officially founded as a Spanish mission in 1776, growing slowly until the gold rush of 1849. The buried station foundations predated 1869. Photographs taken by workers in 1905 show iron rail mounts cast directly into platform stone, not bolted, not attached later, but integrated during original construction. Metallurgical analysis of samples retrieved in the 1920s showed fusion patterns. The iron had been subjected to extreme heat while in contact with the stone, creating molecular bonds between metal and masonry. That kind of fusion requires temperatures and processes that weren't available until the 1880s. Yet, these structures existed beneath buildings, constructed in the 1850s and 60s. Workers from 1889 described them as engineered cavities, not wells. They described them as platforms, not basements. They described rail mounting systems in cities that supposedly had no rails. The map evidence added another layer of impossibility. Pre-1850 cartographic records label the North American interior as Tartary, or independent Tartary, not as empty wilderness, not as unexplored territory, as Tartary, a named region, mapped with cities, marked with population centers. Maps from the 1820s and 1830s show urban settlements in locations that official history describes as unsettled frontier. Then, after 1860, the maps change. Tartary disappears, replaced with unexplored territory or unclaimed lands. The cities vanish from the cartography. The region becomes blank space on later editions. But the buried architectural style matches structures still standing in Siberian cities, attributed to Tartarian construction. The same stonework precision, the same geometric proportions, the same engineering techniques. Buildings in San Francisco, Chicago, New York, buried 12 feet deep, showing design elements identical to surface structures in Irkutsk, Tobolsk, Kazan. European cartographers showed Great Tartary extending across Asia to the Pacific coast on maps published through the 1830s. Later editions erased it, redrew the borders, relabeled the territory. Yet the architecture remained, buried beneath American cities that supposedly had no connection to any such civilization. And then there were the sealed chambers. Modern subway construction keeps breaking into voids beneath street level. Not basements, not sewers. Engineered chambers with vaulted ceilings, precise stonework, circular sockets cut into floors. The sockets measure 6 feet in diameter, 3 to 4 feet deep, lined with dressed stone. Perfectly circular, geometrically exact. Officially, they are labeled as water cisterns. But nothing about them fits that explanation. No water access, no drainage channels, no inlet pipes or outlet systems. The chambers contain these sockets, multiple sockets per chamber, arranged in geometric patterns, but no infrastructure for water collection or distribution. New York MTA workers in the 1970s photographed chambers with metal fixtures embedded in the walls, not bolted to the surface, embedded. The metal was corroded beyond identification, but the mounting points showed engineering precision. Circular anchor points, rectangular socket plates, all fused directly into the stone. Yet, they were found in layers supposedly older than any industrial process, advanced enough to produce such effects. What civilization built train stations before cities had trains? What technology fused metal into stone before industrial metallurgy existed? What urban planning created geometric street grids before official settlement? But here's the part that always gets buried. What civilization built these cities before 1840? Whenever construction crews discover anomalous chambers, the response is immediate. Not study, not documentation, resealing. Seattle Underground opened as a tourist attraction in 1965, showcasing the buried storefronts and streets beneath Pioneer Square. But only a fraction of the underground remains accessible. The most structurally intact sections, chambers with the most sophisticated stonework, rooms with unexplained architectural features, were closed to tours in the 1970s and marked unsafe for public access. Not collapsed, not damaged, unsafe. Chicago has over 40 miles of tunnels discovered during subway expansions in the 1990s. Freight tunnels, the official designation. Built in 1899 for underground cargo transport, abandoned in 1959. But 90% of these tunnels were immediately resealed after discovery, without archaeological survey, without documentation of what lay beyond the explored sections. The contradiction becomes obvious when you examine which sections were sealed first. Not the damaged areas, not the unstable passages. The resealed sections had the most intact stonework, the most precise masonry, the most architecturally sophisticated construction. If it was only about structural safety, why were the oldest, cleanest, most structurally perfect chambers the ones sealed first? The documentation itself tells the story of systematic erasure. Chicago Historical Society archives catalog 847 photographs from the 1857 street raising project. Municipal records confirm these photographs were taken, developed, and catalogued. But only 63 remain in the collection today. The surviving images show surface work, street pavement, building facades, construction equipment. None show the buried structures. None show workers inside the filled buildings. None document what lay beneath. The missing 784 photographs weren't lost to fire or flood. They were removed from the archives, selectively. The catalogue entries remain, with notations like image removed for preservation or transferred to restricted collection. San Francisco blamed the 1906 earthquake for the loss of pre-1870 municipal records. But fire maps from the disaster show the archive building outside the burn zone. The structure survived. Yet the records were demolished anyway, during post-earthquake cleanup operations. Seattle's 1889 fire destroyed pre-1870 construction documents. Chicago's 1871 fire consumed early settlement records. Convenient fires. Perfectly timed, too. Eliminate documentation of the period when buried structures were being filled and sealed. If the buildings were obsolete, why fill them instead of demolish them? If filling was for drainage, why fill intact interiors when simple street raising would suffice? If the work was routine civic improvement, why do the photographs disappear? Seattle's official explanation: fire safety, preventing underground passages from spreading future blazes. But the buried brick streets show no fire damage. Chicago's official explanation: drainage improvement, filling old basements to prevent water accumulation. But the buried sewer systems were superior in engineering to the ones built to replace them. The project didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded. Stopped. The most advanced chambers were reburied the fastest. The most sophisticated architecture was sealed first. The most precise stonework was hidden most thoroughly. It doesn't make sense unless what was being protected wasn't the physical site. It was the historical narrative. And maybe that is why the discoveries from 1857, from 1889, from every excavation that revealed pre-founding infrastructure were quietly reburied. Not to protect the sites from collapse, but to protect the narrative from a question. If these cities were already here before we founded them, who built them? The pattern is clear now. Precision stonework superior to documented 19th century capability. Infrastructure systems predating their official introduction. Mechanical chambers with unknown purpose. Train station foundations in cities before trains arrived. Metal fixtures fused into stone before industrial metallurgy existed. All buried between 1840 and 1870. All explained as street raising. All sealed immediately upon rediscovery. But this wasn't just Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, or New York. London has extensive buried layers beneath the modern city, officially labelled medieval foundations. Paris has underground networks described as ancient quarries. Rome has subterranean structures attributed to early Christian construction. Same depth as the American cities. Same timeline of burial. Same official explanations that don't address the architectural sophistication or the engineering precision. St. Petersburg, Russia, presents perhaps the clearest example. The entire pre-1840 ground floor of the city is now underground. Every building constructed before 1840 has its original first floor below current street level. The official explanation: the marshy ground settled. Buildings sank gradually over decades. But stone doesn't sink. Not uniformly. Not across a 100-mile metropolitan area. Not at exactly the same rate, producing exactly the same 12 to 15 foot elevation change across thousands of structures. What level of civilization builds multi-story stone buildings across 3 continents? What technology produces metal fixtures that corrode beyond identification but remain structurally embedded in masonry? What architectural knowledge creates geometric street grids that span from San Francisco to Prague, all sharing the same construction techniques, the same proportions, the same sophistication? And why does every attempt to study pre-1850 urban archaeology hit institutional resistance? Why are the most intact chambers sealed? Why do the photographs disappear? Why do archive fires consistently destroy records from the exact period when these structures were buried? You can walk into Seattle Underground today. stand in a basement with 16-foot ornate ceilings. Touch stonework superior to the building constructed above it. See windows designed for sunlight, now in permanent darkness. Read the plaques explaining these were always basements, even as you stand in rooms with decorative plasterwork, architectural flourishes, design elements that only make sense in primary living spaces. Does this look like a basement? Or does it look like they buried a city? If Chicago stands on top of a city built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1857. It's what else lies beneath New York, San Francisco, London, Paris, St. Petersburg. What other train stations predate the railroads? What other chambers contain unidentifiable technology? What other layers were quietly reburied long before cameras existed to document them? This wasn't just an archaeological anomaly. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. If this investigation opened something for you, make sure you're subscribed to Forgotten Stories. The next vault opens soon.